Elias, Elijah, Messiah, and Jesus Christ. I'm Kendall Brian Hunter, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Some sort of nutritional supplement I got at Costco. It's winter, people get colds, so there you go. Funny, I tossed the candy cane somewhere there last week. I haven't been able to find it still, so I have to do a little bit more digging. So this is John chapter 1, and it's very complex, and so bear with me, because this may actually be a supersized edition of Get to the Point, just because you think one chapter would be simple, but no, there's a lot of complexities involved. The first thing to note is that there's substantial Joseph Smith translation changes on John 1, verses 1 through 34. So click on the footnote and read that, because if you don't do that, you're just missing out on a lot of stuff that's going on, stuff that's not in the King James text. In fact, stuff that's not in any biblical manuscript. This is stuff that's unique and distinctive to Joseph Smith. And so, read it. Then the rest of the chapter, verses 35, I think, to 51, that's standard King James text. But yeah, we're going to get some of the stuff that's missing. So there's a lot of background resources that you need to read for this chapter. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it's section 7, which is a translation that Joseph Smith did of a John the Beloved wrote a scroll, took it and he hid it up in this cave, and so Joseph Smith was able to translate this scroll without actually having it physically in front of him. And that talks a little bit about the mission of John and John the Baptist, John the Beloved and John the Baptist. And that's the thing to pay attention to, is that we're dealing with two Johns here, John the Baptist and John the Beloved. Another thing is section 93. It's where you get the same overlay. That's, as B.H. Roberts said, that chapter or section 93 is a prose poem. Section 110, where it talks about Moses, Elias, and Elijah coming. Section 27 and verse 7, where it refers to the angel Gabriel as an Elias. And then this very unusual footnote, or interesting footnote, in Mark 9:4, the Joseph Smith translation. And it talks about the Mount of Transfiguration. It said that on the Mount, we understand the Mount of Transfiguration, that would have been Moses and Elijah, as it was in the Kirtland Temple. But the footnote says, and there appeared unto them Elias with Moses, or in other words, John the Baptist and Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Well, so is it Elijah or is it John the Baptist on the Mount of Transfiguration? Well, it's probably both, because we don't have, as section 110 says, we don't have the, or not 110, but section 101 says we don't have the full account there. Another thing to do is the scripture helps. The Guide to the Scriptures, and this is all on the phone app. It's not that the Guide to the Scriptures isn't in the print edition, but we do have in the electronic edition. Read up on Elias and Elijah. Get the Bible dictionary, Elias and Elijah. And then you have the Encyclopedia of the Incorrect Name of the Church. So 4 entries. Elias, spirit of, Elijah, and Elijah, spirit of. And that provide links to the electronic edition of the Encyclopedia of the Incorrect Name of the Church. That's the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, but that's the incorrect name of the church. So we'll go with the correct name of the church and shame our way out of using the incorrect name of the church. Furthermore, for Joseph Smith, you want to get a copy of the Joseph Smith Manual. That's also on your electronic device. You want to read chapter 6 about John the Baptist, chapter 8 about where Joseph Smith uses this expression eliases, and then chapter 28 where Joseph Smith talks about Elijah. And you want to cross-reference that with chapter 11 of the Joseph Fielding Smith Manual, where it talks a little bit, he has this interesting statement about the sealing power, that the sealing power just doesn't work for the dead. It places the stamp of approval upon every ordinance that's done in the church. So Joseph Fielding Smith Manual, chapter 11. Now here's the kicker. This is the one resource that we all want to look at. And it's a sermon Joseph Smith gave on the 10th of March, 1844. So you can find it in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. Oh, silly me, I forgot to put the page reference in it. Well, you can use the index to get to it. And I have a link to the electronic version of it in here in the notes. And right now, as my notes stand, the notes are twice as long as that will fit on the YouTube. They'll fit up on YouTube, so I'm gonna have to cut my notes in half to get it up there. So I'm gonna do some really parsing with it. And the other one is there's this book called Words of Joseph Smith, which is it has the original journal entries that were the basis for the talks. Because when you have talks by Joseph Smith, a lot of the times they're actually amalgamations that. In the case of this one, 10th of March, 1844 sermon, there's 6 different sources. So the main text that we rely upon is Wilford Woodruff. But we have these 5 other sources that are people keeping journals as Joseph Smith's talking, because Joseph Smith didn't have a scribe with him. He'd get up there and talk, and unless you're Wilford Woodruff, you were taking notes, this is kind of disappearing into the air. And so we've actually lost a lot of Joseph Smith's sermons. Thank goodness that Wilford Woodruff was able to preserve a bunch of them, and then later on, Joseph Smith had Willett Richards was able to write down his talks. So we have some other sources, but yeah, we're missing a lot of Joseph Smith. And also, too, is keep in mind is when you're reading the talks and teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith or in the Joseph Smith manual, sometimes they're an amalgamation, is that they took a sentence here and a sentence here, put it together as best they could to reconstruct the talk. So those are the background resources, because we're going to talk about John the Baptist, of course, and also a little bit about John the Beloved, or the Apostle John, but also something called Elias, Elijah, and Messiah. Now, we're up to speed on the spirit of Elijah, I think, although I think sometimes we misunderstand it. We don't know a whole lot about the spirit of Elias, and we know even less about the spirit of Messiah, but this is stuff that Joseph Smith taught, mostly in that talk on 10th of March 1844, and this doctrine also comes up in the Joseph Smith translation. Now we're going to hit a place where the saints and the seers diverge, and it has to do with the translation problem. Is that the Old Testament's written in Hebrew? There's some parts of Daniel that are written in Aramaic, but it's written in Hebrew, and we have that prophet that we call Elijah in there. And it gets in the King James, it gets translated as Elijah. Then as have the New Testament, it's written in Greek, and sometimes the way they express things in Greek didn't quite mesh over. For example, Noah is called Noe, N-O-E, I think it's in the book of Luke in one of them. And sometimes the Hebrew names didn't translate well. And Elijah is one of these cases. When you read the New Testament, you'll see this person called Elias, E-L-I-A-S. It's strong number strong number 2243, and the word appears 29 times in the New Testament. And most new translations translate, it's Elias in Greek, and they translate it. The King James people translate as Elias. Most of the translations nowadays, they translate it as Elijah, like New International Version, J.B. Phillips. And that seems to be a good sense. For example, in the Mount of Transfiguration, it says Moses and Elias appeared there. But, we normally understand that would have been the prophet Elijah giving sealing keys to Peter, James, and John. And it's a similar incident as what happened in the Kirtland Temple. Moses and Elijah appear there to give keys to the prophets, the same way they did in the Kirtland Temple. You also see, this is a good Elias as Elijah is a good translation in James 5:17. Now, there's an issue that comes up here is that when you read Luke 1:17 in the King James Version, it's Gabriel talking to Zacharias. And by the way, Gabriel was also an Elias, and I'll get back to what those terms exactly mean. And he says about his unborn son, John, the person called John the Baptist, and Gabriel says, and he, John, shall go before him, Christ, in the spirit and power of Elias, to turn the hearts of the father to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Now, it says Elias, and it says, turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. Now, we understand that turning the hearts of fathers, that's something that we associate with the prophet Elijah, and so when a scholar translates, says no, that should be Elijah, we understand, okay, yeah, there's because of that one phrase in there, that's a good reason to do it. And kind of the issue that comes up is when Joseph Smith is reading this, but also getting these independent revelations of the Joseph Smith translation, and also in his sermons, that he's understood that this didn't that Elias actually referred to Elias and not Elijah, notwithstanding this expression, turn the hearts of father to the children. And like I said, this is a case where you have to realize that there's an honest disagreement here with the scholars. And I know some people, what they do is they'll read something like this and know Joseph Smith, this whole thing about Elias and Elijah, that's the scholars say that we should do this. And yeah, sometimes we have to, Joseph Smith occasionally makes mistakes. We hold our nose and look past it. And that's not my approach is that I'll just say, hey, look, there's honest disagreements between the scholars and the seers. And it's a good faith disagreement because I can understand why they understand the things that they do, but we can't reconcile it. So let's just side with Joseph Smith on this case because he has too much theology. I mean, this isn't just like one statement. There's pages of stuff in here and sermons that he taught about that. But also keep in mind, too, Article of Faith 8, that the Bible isn't translated correctly. And then Joseph Smith's statement that he said is, I believe the Bible as it read when it came from the pen of original writers. Ignorant translators, careless transcribers, or designing and corrupt priests have committed many errors. And it's possible this may be a transcription problem. This may be one of these errors that crept in that expression. We just don't know enough at the time right now to reconcile both of them. So don't just Joseph Smith sometimes did things. I mean, it's like, I don't do it. Just say, let's have a disagreement and let's preach what Joseph Smith said. And so let me do a quick paraphrase of that 10th of March, 1844 sermon. And you see there's one sermon, parts of it appear in one the chapter about John the Baptist in the Joseph Smith manual. Parts of the sermon appear in the chapter on Elijah. And so it's actually one sermon, and the way it's cut up in the manual, you're not preserved with the flow of logic. And so Joseph Smith taught that there's something called the spirit and power and doctrine of Elias. And that's a forerunner, that when Joseph Smith was ordained to the Aaronic priesthood by John the Baptist, that he is given the power, authority, and doctrine and spirit of Elias. And has two aspects to it. One's a preparer or a forerunner, somebody who goes beforehand and prepares things. But there's also an association with being a restorer, that what an Elias does is restore things. And then after that, you have associated with Melchizedek priesthood is Elijah. And then after that, you have Messiah. And the analogy that Joseph Smith used in this sermon is that what happens is that the spirit of Elias is like the stone cutters that cut the stones. The spirit of Elijah is like the cement that seals the stone together. It's, the sealing power all the way up to the capstone of the temple. And then you have the temple ready by Elias and Elijah. Then you have Messiah comes to the temple to receive it. This is parallels what happened at the Kirtland Temple. Joseph Smith also said the spirit of Messiah is all power in heaven and earth, enthroned in the heavens as kings and kings of Lord of lords. So it may be associated with being exalted, that you started with the Aaronic priesthood, the Melchizedek priesthood. The Melchizedek priesthood gets you to the place of exaltation. Then you have the spirit of Messiah rest upon you. So that's the background that Joseph Smith taught. And so let's dig into the text. And let me switch my glasses to my reading glasses. I should get bifocals, but these glasses still work. Is that in the Joseph Smith translation of John 1, there's this conversation with John the Baptist, and you have priests and Levites who are sent by the Pharisees to talk to him, and they just were asking John the Baptist, okay, John, who are you? What's going on? You're attracting a following. And then you start in verse 20, it says, and this is the record of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who art thou? And he, John, confessed and denied not that he was Elias, but confessed, saying, I'm not the Christ. So it's in the italic parts as you read it. It says that Elias, that's not in the King James text. And yeah, notwithstanding how it reads in King James that he's had the spirit of power of Elijah, that's not a good translation. So let's just set it aside and say something we can't reconcile right now. But let's go with what Joseph Smith said, because he's teaching us something interesting. So John says that, he's Elias, but he's not Christ. Then this group that asked or questioning him, it says, and they asked him, saying, how art thou Elias? And he said, I'm not that Elias who was to restore all things. And this is probably an ancient prophecy that the Jews had. There's going to be an Elias to restore things. We'd understand this to be Joseph Smith, because that's what Joseph Smith's thing is. He had the keys from every single dispensation to restore every single dispensation in our dispensation. And he said, so John's saying, no, I'm not Joseph Smith. I'm not the restorer. And then they asked him, saying, "Art thou that prophet?" And he answered, "No." And this is a bit confusing. Okay, who's this unnamed prophet? And it could be several people. It could be Jeremiah. It could be Elijah. And that goes back kind of this confusing translation of how you render Elias, the Greek word. And then discussion continues in verse 23. Then they said unto him, "Who art thou, that we may give an answer to them that sent us? What sayest thou thyself?" Verse 24. John said, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaias." And that's Greek rendering for Isaiah. So he's quoting John, who's Elias, is quoting Isaiah. And you notice that the Greek expressions, the Hebrew expressions don't translate into Greek, and then we use the Greek to translate to English. And that's why the names seem a little bit funny. And they that who were sent were of the Pharisees, verse 26. And they asked him, said, "Why baptizest thou then, if thou be not the Christ, nor Elias, who is to restore all things, neither that prophet?" So if you unpack that a bit, is that the Jews had this prophecy about three of these prophets would do things associated with baptism. The Christ, the Messiah, would baptize. The Elias, who is to restore all things, or Joseph Smith, would involve with baptism, specifically baptism for the living and for the dead. And then you have that prophet, the unnamed prophet, who, like I said, might be Elijah. That's the one they're looking for. The Jews during Passover leaving the empty chair for Elijah. So, look, if you're not Christ, you're not Elias, and you're not Elijah, why are you baptizing? Now, the Jews did practice baptism as something called a mikvah. And some sects of Judaism do it today, is when you are a Gentile and you convert to Judaism, as was the case with Steven Spielberg's wife, Kate Capshaw. Kate Capshaw, she played Willie in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and she and Steven Spielberg got married. So it's kind of this, people don't like that movie, but it's funny. Steven Spielberg got married as a result of it. And his wife converted to Judaism. She went to the point of being baptized as a Jew. Also, some sects of Judaism, the woman, after they have their period, they'll go through a mikveh for ritualistic cleaning. And you can see videos about where women talk about how they actually like that. So it's cleansing, baptizing people as part of Jewish tradition. And Messiah, Elias, Elijah, and Messiah were all noted for the type of baptism. Then John said unto them, this is verse 27, John answered them, saying, "I baptize with water, but there standeth one among you whom ye know not. He it is of whom I bear record. He is that prophet, even Elias, who coming after me is preferred before me, whose shoe latchet I'm not worthy to unloose, or whose place I'm not able to feel. For he shall baptize not with water, but with fire and with the Holy Ghost." And then the verse 29, the next day John seeth Jesus coming unto him. And so we have the familiar story with Jesus Christ getting baptized, talked about, and Nephi talked about this in 2nd Nephi. What's kind of interesting is, this is where it gets confusing, is that John the Baptist says, oh yeah, Jesus Christ is an Elias. And so it's a very interesting term, is that we'd understand Christ's first ministry as a bit of a preparatory to the second coming. So someone who's preparing as Elias, John was an Elias, Gabriel was an Elias, Joseph Smith is an Elias, even Jesus Christ is an Elias, because he is preparing, Jesus Christ prepares for the Father's coming. And as the way John prepares for Jesus, Jesus prepares for the Father. And like I said, it gets a bit confusing, and this is something that's not quite saturated down to the level of the church, and we'll sit there and get people talk about their vacations or coming with airplane analogies, and that may be helpful. And if that's helpful for you, I don't want to take anything away from you or detract from that. But there's some stuff going on, and we're not really teaching some of this higher stuff. And I wonder if this is the reason why people are just leaving the church, is that we're not teaching the truth, and we're focusing on chili cook-offs and having sweet rolled bakes instead of teaching doctrine. You understand that there's stuff going on in Joseph Smith that we're just not talking about. And part of the stuff is the reason why the church is under condemnation, as you read in section 84, that there's this stuff going on, and there's these ancient prophecies that Joseph Smith is restoring that add substance to what we're doing as a church. And like I said, this is a case where scholars, that if I were to get a degree in Hebrew studies or go to Dallas Theological, I wouldn't be studying this. I'd come back and I'd talk a lot about Maimonides and the Talmud and Jewish interpretation of the Bible, or get Christian interpretation, Aquinas, John Chrysostom, what these other Christian and Jewish scholars have to say about ancient prophecies. But what Joseph Smith's restoring is something completely different, that they had this ancient prophecy that Christ would baptize that John would baptize, Elijah would baptize, Joseph Smith would baptize is contained here in the Joseph Smith translation, and we put it in the back, and so some people miss it. So really crucial to come up with a strategy to read the Joseph Smith translation if you're studying on your phone, because you're missing a lot of stuff. So we're at almost 20 minutes. Like I said, this may be the supersized edition, and I can't remember if I said this, but one of the problems is the notes I have for this are twice as long that's allowable on YouTube, so I'm going to do some parsing down. But yeah, read up on the Guide to the Scriptures and the Bible Dictionary, but also the links to the Encyclopedia of the Incorrect Name of the Church about the spirit of Elias and Elijah. And make sure you read the talk that Joseph Smith gave about the three powers, Elias, Elijah, and Messiah. And I'll give a background for this little interesting thing that's hiding in the back of our Bible. So the Christ quotient. And as I said in the New Testament, everything is the Christ quotient. But one, you're learning about the preparation for Christ, that when Christ came, he just didn't show up, that there's people went before him to prepare him. John the Baptist, you have Joseph Smith preparing the world. But keep in mind that we're also operating in the spirit of Elias, that we're preparing for the second coming as we gather Israel, that as we're doing things like studying our scriptures and taking the gospel seriously and not treating our ward meetings as a neighborhood gathering and, substituting the bread of life for cooked sweet rolls and cupcake parties. That if we're taking Christ seriously, that will help prepare for the second coming. And that is the point.